In 1862, a man named Captain Elias Porter boards a troop train just south of Washington, D.C. Knowing that if he does his job right, no one will ever remember his name. He's not a famous general or a hero from the front line. On paper, he's just a staff officer with a notebook, one of the men expected to turn rail maps and timetables into victories. But as the cars rattle out of the capital and into Virginia, Porter feels less like a planner and more like cargo, shoved forward on rails that might not even belong to his side tomorrow. For him, the railroad isn't a scenic route from one town to the next. It's the only way thousands of men, horses, and cannon can survive this far from home. Every bridge his train crosses has already been argued over in tents and telegraph offices, measured in tons of food and shells and wounded. Today, I'm leaving Washington by rail too, riding Amtrak's Crescent out of D.C. and heading south toward the same country Porter's trains once fed. The cars are smoother, the schedules are reliable, and no one on board expects to step off into a battlefield. But when the tracks dive into the trees, slip past quiet stations, or cross a river on a high steel bridge, it's easy to imagine Porter here, counting cars, checking his watch, gambling his army's fate on whether these rails will hold. This episode is about the war he fought with schedules and sidings and wooden trestles, the war you can still trace from a window seat as you follow the rails south. We'll follow one southbound pass on the Crescent, from Washington down through Virginia, the Carolinas, and into Tennessee, and line it up as closely as we can with the railroads that actually mattered to the Civil War along this corridor. As my train eases out of Washington Union Station and into the tunnels, it feels like the safest part of the journey. Back in the early 1860s, Porter knew the danger actually started right here. The rails we're rolling onto weren't just a way out of the city. They were the only reliable way to feed and reinforce the capital. When the Crescent bursts into daylight and heads for the Potomac, I'm mostly thinking about camera angles. For Captain Elias Porter, this river crossing was the first test. The railroad bridge here, what we now call the Long Bridge, was a lifeline the Union could not afford to lose. A strip of timber and iron that tied Washington to Virginia and everything beyond. Today we cross in seconds, gliding over water that looks almost peaceful. In Porter's day, this span was watched, guarded, repaired after floods and hard winters, and constantly evaluated for how quickly it could be destroyed if the army ever had to fall back. For him, a bridge was never just a bridge. It was a yes or no question. Can the army move today or not? On the far side of the river, my train is already slowing for Alexandria, Virginia. I see a commuter town and a pleasant riverfront. Porter saw a forward operating base. Once Union troops took Alexandria early in the war, its depots and sidings turned into an extension of Washington itself. A safer place to stage trains, sort supplies, and push the railhead a little farther into a hostile state. South of Alexandria, the Crescent settles into a rhythm. Small stations most passengers never think twice about, names on the timetable ticking past. For Porter, each of those small stops was a potential breaking point, a place where one missing rail or one late train could ripple all the way back to the capital. Manassas. As we roll past Manassas, it barely registers as more than a small Virginia stop. Some houses, a parking lot, a station sign out the window. In 1861 and 1862, this was Manassas Junction, one of the most important rail crossroads in the country. Two lines met here, the Orange and Alexandria and the Manassas Gap, and that simple X of track helped decide where the first big clashes of the war would happen. At the First Battle of Manassas or Bull Run, people from Washington actually rode out toward this area with picnic baskets, climbing the nearby hills to watch what they thought would be a quick, almost theatrical fight that would settle things once and for all. By the end of the day, they were caught in the roads with panicked soldiers and wagons, learning the hard way that the war was going to be longer and uglier than anyone had promised. For Captain Elias Porter, a place like this wasn't just a dot on a timetable, it was a pressure point. If you held the junction, you could feed an army from two directions, shift men and guns faster than anyone marching on dusty roads. If you lost it, trains stopped, supplies piled up in the wrong place, and whole campaigns had to be rewritten. The first and second battles of Bull Run weren't just fights over fields and hills. They were fights over who got to use this junction as the hinge for the rest of the war in Virginia. Culpeper. Culpeper slides by my window in a few seconds. Fields, a few sidings, a town that feels like it's catching its breath between bigger cities. During Porter's time, quiet places like this did some of the loudest work. This is staging ground country, where sidings filled with boxcars, hay bales and barrels of hardtack, all waiting for a locomotive to shove them farther toward the front. On a map in Washington, Culpeper might be a small name. On Porter's rail map, it was one more test of how far the iron road could stretch without snapping. Charlottesville. Charlottesville today feels like a college town with a train line running through it. Brick buildings, students, a station that serves as a gateway to the mountains and wine country. In Porter's war, this region sat uncomfortably close to a web of Confederate rails, including lines that fed directly toward Richmond. He knew that every schedule he kept, every bridge his crews protected to the north, had an answer on the other side. Someone else's trains, someone else's depots, someone else doing the same math with different uniforms. When my train pauses here, it's a chance to stretch your legs. For him, towns in this band of Virginia were reminders that the railroad wasn't a one-sided miracle. It was a tool both armies were racing to use better and faster. For Porter, that threat wasn't theoretical. Earlier in the war, he'd stood not far from here, near the Virginia Central Bridge over the Rivanna River at Charlottesville, after a Union raid had done its work. The span was down, timbers charred and tumbled into the water. Rails lying crooked on both banks where they'd been torn up and shoved aside. For days, nothing moved west on that line. No food, no ammunition, no hospital trains until crews could throw up a replacement crossing. Looking out my window at an intact bridge in a quiet station, it's easy to forget how quickly one night of fire could turn a place like this from a gateway into a dead end. Lynchburg. When we reach Lynchburg, the land suddenly feels more compressed. River, hills, and tracks all threading through the same narrow corridors. During the war, this kind of place was a dream for quartermasters and a nightmare for enemies. Lynchburg was a rail and river hub, a spot where Confederate boxcars and steamboats traded loads, where supplies bound for armies in the field could be shuffled, repacked, and sent out again. On the other side of the lines, Porter and his colleagues stared at towns like this on their maps, knowing that if they could ever cut those rails or choke those docks, whole enemy armies would feel it weeks later. From my window, it's just another station stop. For the staff officers of the 1860s, hubs like Lynchburg were the knots in the rope holding the war together. Danville. By the time we roll into Danville, the pattern of small towns and rail yards almost feels familiar. Another cluster of warehouses, another fan of tracks, another brief pause in the journey. But by 1864, Danville was anything but ordinary. As Richmond and Petersburg started to slip from Confederate hands, this town became an emergency lifeline. A last-ditch rail link trying to keep an army fed and moving while everything else frayed. A junction like Danville could be the difference between an opponent who could still move and one who was stuck, waiting for trains that would never come. When my train glides out of town on a smooth schedule, it's hard not to think about how many people once stayed up nights, trying to keep those same rails from going silent. South of Danville, the names on my timetable change and the landscape starts to open up. Longer stretches of track between towns, more sky between the tree lines. For a modern passenger, it just feels like we're finally getting some distance under the wheels. For Porter, pushing into country like this meant leaving the relative comfort of the Washington orbit and stepping into territory where his mental rail map was less certain. Every new bridge, every unfamiliar station, every quiet siding was another question. Can this line carry an army, or will it crumble the first time we truly lean on it? Part of why this stretch feels so exposed to Porter is that he's seen what happens when the rails don't hold. Earlier in the war, he rode a short work train out toward the Rappahannock, to the point where the last intact siding ended, then swung down to a horse and followed the right-of-way where the engines couldn't go. Ahead of him, the scene looked like something out of the reports from places like Potomac Creek and the Orange and Alexandria line after a raid. Every timber bridge burned out, every rail pried up and twisted, the way cavalry patrols and raiding parties liked to leave them. Locomotives lay wrecked in the ditches, their wheels half buried in mud, and boxcars had been burned down to metal skeletons and ash. The only sounds there were axes and hammers as construction crews tried to drag the line back to life. One span, one beam, one rail at a time. Once you've ridden along a torn-up railroad like that, a quiet, intact line like the one under my train never looks the same again. Crossing into North Carolina, the trip starts to feel long instead of dramatic. Longer runs between towns, the land rolling under the wheels. This is exactly the kind of country where the war's rail story usually gets skipped. On most maps, it's just background. On Porter's mental map, it was a quietly critical spine holding the Confederate interior together. One of the biggest rail stories down here doesn't even show up on my timetable. Greensboro, the place that quietly became the Confederacy's warehouse and waiting room. During the war, Greensboro turned into a storehouse and rail center, a midpoint on a long arc of track that connected Charlotte to Goldsboro. Boxcars full of food and uniforms, hospital trains loaded with wounded, even government offices on the run, all funneled through this stretch of North Carolina rail. When everything began to collapse in 1865, Confederate President Jefferson Davis came through Greensboro by train, still trying to direct a war that the rails themselves were telling him was almost over. For Captain Porter, watching from the other side of the lines, Greensboro was a lesson he'd see again and again. It was proof that if you gave a town a junction and a couple of good depots, it could suddenly matter more to the war than cities 10 times its size. Out toward the upcountry, near towns like Crescent, inland lines linking the Carolinas and Georgia took the same beating. Rails torn up, bridges burned, detours getting longer and longer as the system wore out. As our train makes its way past places like High Point and Salisbury, it's easy to think of them as filler between bigger names. In the 1860s, they were links in a critical north-south spine, moving Confederate troops and supplies toward Virginia and back again. Porter would have seen this chain of stations as a kind of X-ray of the Confederate interior. Every siding and water stop another bone that might break under pressure. By late in the war, worn-out track, scavenged locomotives, and constant overuse turned this whole corridor into a fragile lifeline held together by patchwork repairs and desperation. In the 1850s, the Charlotte and South Carolina Railroad tied this town to Columbia and the older South Carolina lines, creating a continuous route toward Richmond once the Piedmont Railroad was finished during the war. That connection became a vital north-south link for the Confederacy, feeding General Lee's army from states farther south. It also created bottlenecks. Different track gauges, overworked yards, and junctions where everything had to be unloaded and reloaded by hand. On Porter's maps, a city like Charlotte wasn't just a dot. It was a choke point. If you could overload its yards, wreck its rolling stock, or sever the lines leading into it, you didn't just hurt one town. You strangled everything that depended on those tracks all the way to Virginia. South of Charlotte, the Crescent threads into South Carolina, on tracks that look unremarkable from a coach seat. By the time Porter was studying its lines, that pride in being a railroad pioneer had been beaten up by overused rails, burned bridges, and a war that was literally tearing the iron out of the ground. South of the North Carolina line, the Crescent starts threading through country that once fed into towns like Spartanburg and Greenville, places that were already on the map when the Civil War turned rails into targets. South Carolina liked to call itself a railroad pioneer. By 1860, it had lines running inland from the coast, built long before some northern roads even existed. But war is hard on pioneers. Years of pushing trains beyond what the rails were built for, constant troop movements, and targeted Union raids left hundreds of miles of South Carolina track worn out or torn up. Engines and cars were destroyed or captured, bridges burned, and entire sections of line left so twisted they were called Sherman's neckties. From Porter's perspective, watching from the Union side, this was the dark mirror of his own job. While he fought to keep his lines in repair, whole stretches of Confederate railroad down here were grinding themselves to pieces under the weight of a war they could no longer sustain. Near towns like Clemson, the train slips through country that once sat uncomfortably close to another key Confederate route, the inland lines linking the Carolinas and Georgia. Some of those tracks carried troops rushing to plug gaps along the coast. Others hauled the last carloads of supplies trying to reach the front before Union columns or Union gunboats cut the way. Every extra mile a Confederate train had to detour around a broken line. Every day a junction was out of service, brought his own side one step closer to owning the timetable. By the time the Crescent reaches northern Georgia, through places like Gainesville and Toccoa, the hills get steeper, the curves sharper, and the story tighter. The easy Piedmont grades are gone, and the bridges suddenly feel higher. In the 1860s, that north-south line between Atlanta and Chattanooga, the Western and Atlantic, twisted through cuts, tunnels, and river crossings that were both engineering feats and military vulnerabilities. A single blown bridge or blocked tunnel up here could back trains up for miles, leaving men and supplies stalled far from where they were needed. Porter's notebook from this phase of the war would have been full of ugly questions with no easy answers. How many trains can this grade handle in a day? How quickly can we repair a trestle if the enemy hits it? How many men will starve or fall back if we guess wrong? As my own train winds through North Georgia and angles toward Chattanooga, you can feel the route tightening. The gaps between stops shrink, the number of bridges and cuts multiplies, and the landscape starts to do more of the talking. For a staff officer like Porter, the math gets harsher here. Every mile cost more in fuel, more in wear on locomotives, more in risk if the enemy decided to strike. But if you could hold this corridor open, if you could keep trains running through these hills, you could turn a remote mountain town on the Tennessee River into the best supplied fortress in the Western Theater. That's the calculation he rode into Chattanooga with. And it's the shadow that still hangs over these tracks when you look out from a modern coach seat. When the timetable finally flips to Chattanooga, it doesn't sound like a capital or a famous city. If you controlled this junction, you didn't just win a town, you grabbed the handle of the whole Western War. By late 1863, when the big fighting around Chickamauga and Chattanooga was done, this quiet bowl of river and hills mattered more than ever. By the time my train reaches Chattanooga, the names on the timetable feel less like separate towns and more like links in a chain that's finally pulled tight. For Captain Elias Porter, this city wasn't just another stop. It was the crossroads the whole Western War bent toward. Rails from Nashville, Knoxville, Atlanta, and points beyond all threaded into this basin, turning a small river town into the hinge between the Ohio Valley and the Deep South. From my window I see bridges, yards, and hills crowding in around the tracks. In Porter's day, each of those elements came with a calculation. How many trains per day, how much food and ammunition, how long the line could stay open under fire. When the fighting around Chickamauga and Chattanooga finally settled, control of this hub meant control of the railroads that could either feed a Confederate defense or fuel a Union advance. For the first time on this journey, Porter could look south from a secure railhead. Behind him lay the long, fragile corridor back to Washington. The bridges he'd worried over, the junctions he'd tried to keep in Union hands. Ahead of him lay a single line of track diving into the hills toward Atlanta. A campaign that hadn't started yet, but was already taking shape in the margins of his notebook. He's already hearing scraps of reports from farther down that line. Of raiders in civilian clothes, a stolen locomotive, and a wild attempt to tear the Western and Atlantic apart by seizing a train in motion. For a man who lives by timetables, that's the nightmare scenario. The enemy not just wrecking your tracks, but taking your train to do it. My own train stops here, at least for this story. We followed Porter from the capital's edge, across the early war bridges and Virginia junctions, down through the Carolinas and into this mountain bowl where so many rail lines and lives converged. The Western and Atlantic running south out of Chattanooga will have its own chapter. Another episode where these same rails carry the war, and our staff officer, toward a city born from a surveyor's stone and a promise of trains. I step off the train onto the platform in Chattanooga, and for a moment it feels like any other long-distance stop. Stretch your legs, check your phone, look for the station sign. In Porter's time, these tracks were the throat that fed whole armies. Today they're just another line on the timetable, but the shape of the city around them still gives the old mission away. Behind me, the rails run back toward Washington, along the route we've been tracing all episode. Bridges he worried over, junctions he tried to keep in Union hands. Ahead of me, other lines slip south and west, toward Atlanta and the deeper South, carrying echoes of campaigns that haven't shown up in this story yet. For now, this is where we stop. At a quiet platform in a town that once decided how far the war could travel by rail. Standing here, it's easy to see why Porter filled so many notebook pages with numbers and names instead of speeches about glory. In a war that stretched across thousands of miles, Places like this station platform. These tracks, these junctions, this narrow basin between hills, mattered as much as any famous hilltop or ridge. And as my own train waits to head back north, I can't help thinking that every departure board is still, in its own way, a map of what matters enough to keep the rails moving. Standing here, it's easy to imagine Porter boarding a different train months later, this time facing north instead of south. The same rails that once dragged him toward the front would carry him back past the junctions he worried over and the bridges he fought to keep standing. On a timetable, it would look like a simple return trip. Chattanooga to Washington, one more soldier going home by rail. But every station rolling past his window would be a memory check. Did the line hold? Did the plan work? Did the war change this place for better or worse? In a future episode, we'll follow that northbound ride, tracing how the Crescent's path back toward the capital lines up with the war's own long journey from chaos to collapse. For now, I'm keen on the rails, and this has been the southbound chapter of Captain Elias Porter's War.